All right, as part of the Dodd-Frank legislation, part of that was the Volcker Rule, and that is now coming into effect. What type of an actual impact or an effect do you think that's going to have?
Well, it's already had, I think, some salutary effect, but I'm disappointed that it's only going to have limited effect. It was fiercely opposed by Wall Street, by the great big financial houses. It was an effort by Paul Volcker to really undo, in a different way, a decision made at the end of the Clinton administration to allow financial firms to do everything. As a response to the Depression and the collapse in 1929 and the Depression in the 30s, an act called the Glass-Steagall Act was passed, which said banks have to do banking and traders can trade, but banks aren't supposed to trade because trading is inherently risky. And when you trade, you can borrow money in order to invest in stocks and bonds and things like that. And if the prices of the market collapse, or if you misjudge things and you buy quote unquote toxic assets, you're going to lose your equity. If you're a bank doing that, what's going to happen is the amount of money for depositors, the banking function, is going to be thrown into chaos or go into bankruptcy or something like that. So the wisdom in the 1930s was to separate the two. That wisdom was ignored, bipartisan, both Republicans and Democrats at the end of the Clinton administration, and the prohibition, the separation, was withdrawn, was removed, so banks and trading could all get together. And starting in the late 90s, 2000, banks, financial firms, Goldman, JP Morgan, Chase, etc., went into trading for their own account to make profits for the bank on a huge scale by borrowing money. And what happened is they borrowed too much money. Bear Stearns was levered, I think, 35 to 1. Leverage is the amount of money you borrow. Lehman Brothers was levered 44 to 1, which is a very, very risky position. It only makes sense if you're absolutely guaranteed that prices are going to stay the same. Because if prices start to drop, your assets go down, you got to pay back your loans, and you don't have enough, you can't sell your assets and get the money to pay back your loans. So you go bankrupt. It was in effect what happened to Bear and Lehman. So Paul Volcker suggested we ought to go back with a rule, not with a statute, that would cause the banks to be limited in the extent they could do proprietary trading for themselves, buying and selling securities, mostly short-term, a lot of times high-frequency trading. And Wall Street fought back against that, well, because they wanted to keep the cash cow. They make more money on trading than they do providing financial services to companies and to individuals. And it took the Securities and Exchange Commission a long time to come up with a rule. I think it's like 200 pages or something like that. And there was one comment I saw that the only thing the Volcker Rule is doing is making more money for lawyers and accountants, which is true with all these big pieces of legislation in our society. Sarbanes-Oxley before, Dodd-Frank, this. They're so long, they're so complicated, you have to hire professionals to figure out what the business people can do. But for reasons of the regulation, but I also think for prudential reasons, because trading is risky and new capital requirements were imposed, a number of the big houses have backed down, they've backed away from proprietary trading. They're not doing it as much as they did before 2008, but they're still doing it. My own feeling is that we should go back to the old Glass-Steagall. We should just say banking is the important function for the people, for the economy. That's the public utility which needs to be protected and built up and financed. Trading that's just gambling. And if people want to gamble, they can gamble, but let them use their own money. And be completely separate from the financing which creates growth in our economy.
Sure. Just like people should be using their own money if they want to be gambling, people are now starting to use their own cars to be taxi services. Uber has been in the news a great deal lately. It calls into question some different issues as far as government regulations of the market and things along those lines there. What types of thoughts could you offer on disruptive innovations like Uber?
Well, I was just going to say that one of the great arguments for free markets, for capitalism, is the possibility for invention, for creative destruction, as Schumpeter talked about years ago, as disruptive innovation, where people come up mostly with technologies. It's not so much new ideas. It's new ideas that get into technology, like cell phones, like the invention of electricity, like the invention of automobiles. All these things which have made our lives in the early 21st century so much easier, so much more enjoyable. They came from somebody coming up with a new product and a new service, and it made people's lives better off. However, every innovation is a threat to the status quo. Automobiles were a threat to horse carriages and buggy makers and blacksmiths. Uber is a threat to the existing licensed taxi cab system. And so they are organizing, in France in particular, but in San Francisco, especially in New York City, they're organizing politically to control markets. So one of the examples about Uber that we're thinking about is an example of how markets can really work to serve customers. It's the customers who are benefiting, but also it's the people who are driving the cars for Uber. They're making more money. I happened to run across in a little store here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I was sending a package, and the two guys were talking about Uber. And one guy was a taxi driver, and he was giving all the reasons why Uber is dangerous and bad, and you can't trust the drivers, and they're not well insured, et cetera, et cetera. And then he left, and then the guy behind the counter kind of said, well, you know, I have a friend. He's a stay-at-home dad, and the previous weekend it was a big event in the city of Minneapolis. Lots of people in town, parades and things like that, and he made $1,000 in a weekend. Now, for a person who's not making much money, whose wife is carrying the economic load of the family, this was really, really important to him, and he could not have made that money and help out his kids and feel better as a husband and a father if it weren't for Uber. He can't take a full-time job as a taxi driver. He delivers good service. So why should local governments restrict the people who want to work for Uber and the customers who want to use it? I don't see that there's a strong argument. It means that the people who have been benefiting from the old system are going to have to change and adjust. But fundamentally, life, capitalism, is change all the time, and it's about risk, and it's about how we adapt to change, to innovation, and the responsibility for adoption, it seems to me, is on us. We shouldn't put it off to the government to create markets and to create monopolies and cartels to protect us, to give us some sort of an entitlement which other people can't benefit from.
Let's go ahead and change gears real quick here. Recently there was 100 doctors that challenged the level of pricing that goes into drugs and the prescription drugs specifically, and I guess we were wondering if that's actually appropriate when it comes to drug prices, and that's not really the market setting the price in some cases. And so, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the drug pricing these days is a worthy issue when we think about the ethics, the morality, the fairness of capitalism, whether you use markets, whether you use government regulations. And to me, you've got a tug of war here between two things. I mean, on the one hand, you have the common sense need to create incentives to invent new drugs, to deal with things like cancer, to deal with things like hepatitis C, I think it is. On the other hand, you have the interest of people who need these medicines, and most people are not wealthy. They cannot pay a lot of money. So if you price the medicines through regulation to cost a lot of money, then you've set in place incentives for drug companies and scientists to develop new things, but you're putting a huge burden on individuals who then have to lay it off on government, or they have to lay it off on insurance companies, or they have to reduce their own assets. I mean, when you see drug regimens that can cost $100,000, $250,000 a year for a person, when the average, what is the average family income in the United States? It's something like $49,000 a year. It seems so disproportionate that I think people are justified in saying somehow the system isn't working right. But then we don't have, so what's the answer? Should it be the government provides medicines at a very, very cheap price? Should we not give patents to the inventors so we have generics, which can be mass produced at a low price? If you go that way, you're taking care of the customers, people who use the drugs, but then you're not creating the incentives for the inventions. To me, it's a tough problem. And where we're at is some blend between markets and governments. But I would argue now we set up a system where the cartel power of the governments, the regulation, the insurance companies, and the drug companies is such that they can push the prices up to a disturbing level.
And one final topic we were going to quickly cover is the Apple and the massive amounts of loss that they just took in the stock market. Main reason for that, it seems like, is that they were looking for short-term profits, and specifically the idea that they made a large amount of money in this quarter, but because of the expectations of the market, they didn't quite make enough. And so it seems like again it's short-termism that has come up in our previous conversations, and those types of outsized expectations. How do we get around that so that we can have a more sustainable growth in the economy?
Well, that's just a very big problem, because when companies chase earnings, you get into earnings management. When you get into earnings management, you cut corners in all kinds of ways. We just saw Toshiba basically lying about its income, and half of the board and the senior executives had to resign, and they just wanted to show short-term profits. And so that's a systemic misdirection of the intellectual energies and the management energies of people in markets and in capitalism. The other big issue you have with a situation like Apple is, who are the owners? The short-term, the pressure in the short term to show profits is justified as the people who own the stock. Because if the profits hit expectations in the short term, which means, by the way, you're turning over management of expectations to outsiders who have no responsibility for running the company, where their judgment is always on the optimistic side, or the high side. They always want more and more and more. They're not prudent, they're not realistic, but they're outsiders, and they're setting these expectations, which if Apple doesn't meet, then there's a sell-off in the stock. And everybody says, oh, you're hurting your owners. Well, the people who own Apple stock today, they've never given money to Apple. Those shares were sold years ago. This is a secondary market. These are people who are owning Apple, I submit to you, primarily because they want to trade. They want to buy low and sell high. So they're more like renters of stock than real owners. And I think one way forward is to, as we say, a rose by any other name is still a rose. A renter is a renter. They're not truly owners. And we ought to say, if you're renting stocks, and you'll flip them at any time, or you'll go in and out of the market many times a day, playing on immediate arbitrage opportunities, then don't complain. The company should not be there to meet your expectations. The company should be there to meet the expectations of customers and employees and its creditors and its long-term owners, which Apple is doing remarkably well. They made more money than they ever had before, I think. But, quote unquote, as you said, it wasn't enough for a particular class of people who, again, are traders, not with no long-term commitment to Apple. They will sell Apple stock in a heartbeat if for some reason they think they can do better elsewhere.
Great, thanks.